I would like to welcome you to today's Expert Mini Briefing webinar, Maximizing Sourcing Value Through Supply Intelligence. My name is David Goodstein, and I am the webinar coordinator for the Outsourcing Institute, and it is our pleasure to be the co-host of today's event with NEO Group. Before we commence today's session, I would like to say a few brief words about the Outsourcing Institute in case you are not familiar with us. The Outsourcing Institute is a professional association dedicated to providing independent, best practice tools, roadshow events, and networking opportunities for all forms of outsourcing. Located at outsourcing.com, we have 70,000 members globally. We specialize in providing low-cost and no-cost alternatives for outsourcing buyers in need of RFP tools, vendor selection assistance, training, as well as general support and coaching. For those of you who are in the market in this space, we offer an array of very targeted sponsorships and promotional opportunities. Our sister company, CMS, provides recruiting services for those seeking to hire outsourced professionals experienced in buying, selling, managing, and consulting in this arena. Our contact information is at the bottom of the screen for those who have any questions. So without further ado, I will turn it over to our host, Atul Vashistha, Chairman of NEO Group, and he will introduce himself and begin the presentation.
Thank you, David. I'm delighted to be here today to talk to you about how one can maximize the benefits from sourcing by leveraging supply intelligence. So quick brief on myself. I'm the chairman of NEO Group. I've been in this industry for about 20 years, the last almost 13 now, as the founder and CEO of the company, NEO Group. So we've been advising Global 2000 companies for the last 12 plus years on how to manage the whole outsourcing, the global sourcing life cycle. And most recently, for the last 2 years, we have this web-based service that helps companies figure out how to best monitor the risk associated with their outsourcing or shared services effort at a country, city, and supplier level. But again, let's jump in on more detail regarding the topic today. So let's first talk about what is challenging in outsourcing. And then after that, I'll talk about potential solutions, but in this case, for today's topic, specifically focused on how to address these outsourcing issues by leveraging supply intelligence model and by having a supply monitoring program. So when one reflects on outsourcing, you start to realize that the issues happen because of certain things that companies do at each stage of the outsourcing life cycle. At stage one, which is the whole development of what to outsource, often the wrong processes are chosen for many reasons. Many times these are the processes the company is not doing well, but without regard for what level of communications, decision-making, domain knowledge is required for the partner to do well. And so on, with some of the biggest ones being how the relationship is governed, how the relationship is managed. And with the significant geographic distribution that's happening of suppliers and a company's operations, that leads to other problems. But many of these nuances of location, along with the supply capability by location, is not necessarily looked at. Of course, we also find there's constantly negative opinions within the company, but we also see this politically. And of course, as we enter election seasons, we see this even more so. So these, of course, don't help either. At the same time, when we look at scorecards, this was one of the scorecards I pulled from the web from one of the larger insurance companies. As you look at the scorecard, what you recognize is that many of the service levels are actually covered, but you don't see anything that's focused on location. And we know, for example, that a location Manila versus a location Bangalore versus Shanghai, local factors disrupt operations, make operations more expensive, make operations more difficult, but many companies are not looking at those factors. And so they wonder why they're having challenges once they've been in a location for a period of time. So the solution that I want to pose to you, that I want you to think about is, how do you leverage supply intelligence to make sure you don't make these same mistakes, whether through the sourcing life cycle or whether you are doing this on an ongoing basis, which is managing your partners. So think about, how do you leverage supply intelligence in sourcing strategy? Making sure you understand the risks associated with these locations with the operating model, with the financials. So not just thinking about what the cost structure is today, but where is it headed? Inflation, salary raises, size of the labor pool. And so then you make allocation decisions about locations just like you do with your own stocks in the stock market. In the sourcing process, thinking through by leveraging supply intelligence, which suppliers offer less risk, which ones to avoid, but really matching your process to the right supplier. And again, leveraging the supply intelligence in the negotiation process. For the governance and vendor management, I'm going to address this later. I think it will become obvious as I go through this. So let's take a look at how companies that are doing a better job at managing their vendors, how they are doing that by managing their global risks. So the question I have for you is, as you think about this, are you monitoring the risk associated with the location you are at? Are you just monitoring the financial risk of the supplier? Or are you also going beyond that? Human capital, service capability. Are you looking at the risk in the city you're performing? Are you just looking at environmental issues? Are you also looking at labor pool, quality of life? And kind of take the same to the country level. So what I would suggest to you is to create a framework where you identify the key risk criteria. And I'll share with you kind of what we identified. And make sure you have a system in place to continuously collect and aggregate this data, but then have this analytical ability to see how risk has changed. And then also be able to predict where risk is headed. And so once you have this in place, now you can look at a number of different things you ought to be doing, actions you might need to take to make sure that risk is actually mitigated. So we created this supply risk model that looked at risk at a country, city, and supplier level. And we recognized as we were doing this, again, because we've been dealing with this for Fortune 500, Global 2000 companies, not just in Asia Pacific or the US, but really around the world, that these are the risk factors that one needs to keep an eye on to ensure that the country risk, city risk, and supplier risk is being addressed properly. So you'll see here, for example, at a supplier level, this is not just about the D&B rating of a supplier. This goes well beyond that. At a city and country level, this is not just about a report that you pick up from The Economist. That's generic. We're talking about real-time monitoring of factors that either disrupt operations or make it more challenging. So this is not just about a flood that shuts down Mumbai for 2 days or a typhoon that shuts down Manila for 2 days. This is also about how the labor pool in San Jose, Costa Rica is shrinking, so you really are not able to scale up fast. And how do you address that? So just as an example, at a country level, geopolitical risk category, you can see how you have to dig deeper to really understand if that risk is changing and how that is impacting you and what action you need to take. So it's not just floods and drought, but also crime rates, ethnic tension, tenure of the government, political stability. Similarly, at a city level, it's not just about the salaries, but salary growth at different levels. How is rent growing? Are there enough hotels? Are local taxes changing? And then similarly at a supplier level, go deeper to understand not just the financial stability of the supplier, but is their operating model changing? Do they have more people on shore now compared to what they used to? What is their attrition rate? What is the employee utilization? Do they have new delivery centers? Again, all those start to then provide you a much more comprehensive view of risk. So the first goal of this whole aspect is to be able to monitor. And I'll show you some specific examples from client slides on how they are monitoring. So first you need to be able to monitor to see, has risk really changed? So for example here, very quickly, by having a risk model in place, one can take a look at it and saying, okay, in El Salvador, for this quarter, the geopolitical risk has changed. Whereas in Nicaragua, same thing. Whereas in India, the macroeconomic risk has changed, while in Philippines, the financial risk has changed. And then, of course, because you're looking at this data to be able to go deeper. Similarly, for suppliers, being able to do something similar is to be able to track and monitor this risk because of the factors I was talking about, and noticing, for example, that in Wipro, a number of risks has changed this quarter over last quarter. So you're able to focus your governance and vendor management efforts in a very focused manner. So the other aspect of risk is not just being able to monitor it, but able to predict where risk is headed, because that enables you to take the appropriate action. So in this case, for example, it shows a slide from where risk is headed in India at a macroeconomic level. By looking at this, one is able to very quickly focus and recognize that currency risk has changed. So what should I be doing? And this is some of the areas where companies then respond to putting maybe a hedging strategy in place, or relooking at their contract and ensuring that the right kind of clauses exist to be able to share risk and not have to burden or have to face the entire risk. Now, most of this kind of effort is done on a quarterly basis by companies. That's how we do it in our service called GSRM, or Global Supply Risk Monitor. But we find that it's equally important to have timely alerts. For example, 4 days ago, the employees in a location called Nasik in India for WNS started talking about going on strike regarding the firing of few of their employees, their partners, and also they were asking for higher salaries. What about recently the anti-offshoring bill that now has over 90 sponsors in the House in the U.S. Changing of taxes in India, for example, or the discussion in Parliament about potentially changing taxes. So all this matters. You don't want to hear about this month, 2 or 3 months later. You want to hear about it as it's happening, so you can actually create risk mitigation strategies on a much more timely basis. So one of the other things you have to have in place is to have the ability to have timely alerts. Now, alerts, again, not just based on financial risk and weather, but much more comprehensive. So we look at this as proactive alerts. These are alerts where warning is given about a strike, about a potential discussion of a change in law, or in many cases, post-event alerts. It could be a terrorist action or a fraud. So what this does is it enables you to, again, take much quicker action than you would otherwise. Let's share some examples on how some of these alerts have created significant benefits to customers. This is an example of an alert that we issued regarding a change in the software technology parks of India, the STPI law, that basically would have removed an export tax of over 10%. Now, we predicted that it was not going to be renewed because we had seen how the government was struggling with its own tax base, its own revenue budget, and really was going to try to figure out other ways to garner more taxes. We predicted that. At the same time, we also informed in this alert that there was a second scheme that existed in this location called the Special Economic Zones, that if you migrated to, you would continue to have the same benefits. Well, one of our clients looked at the alert, heeded the advice, made the change, and now saves over $3 million a year. In fact, in 2012, it's going to be over $6 million a year because they made the timely move. So again, it's not just about weather, it's not just about financials, it's about much more comprehensive risk monitoring. These are examples of some of the recommendations that had been made. So one of the things that we think it's important, so we do this, is to capture what others are doing in terms of how they monitor risk and have this data available to our client base. So you ought to think about the same things, which is when currency risk happens, what should I do? When weather risk happens, what should I do? When a strike happens, what should I do? Again, I'm maybe making it sound simpler, but really think through what are some standard risk mitigation practices that ought to be in place. So finally, what becomes important at the end of all this is to have a system in place that enables you to monitor risk, enables you to predict risk, and then enables you to manage risk. I'm going to share a few more slides as I go through this, but I do want to thank you for joining this webinar. A very quick one, but hopefully what this does for you is help you understand how one can leverage supply intelligence to improve the outcomes of the entire sourcing life cycle, and more importantly, how you can leverage supply monitoring, supply intelligence to better monitor, predict, and manage supply chain risk so you're able to improve vendor governance and be able to improve the ongoing management of your suppliers. And one either creates a tool like this themselves or has the ability to leverage a tool like what Neo Group provides, which is a global supply risk monitoring. David, I'm happy to turn it over to you, or I'm happy to flip through some of the other slides that address Neo Group in a little bit more detail.
Yeah, you can go ahead and skip through those slides. I just want to thank you for today's webinar, and I want to thank Neo Group on behalf of the Outsourcing Institute, and also thank everybody out there for listening. So go right ahead.
Thank you, David. So just wanted to share with you a little bit of the company for those of you who stayed along. So I founded the company back in 1999, and since then we've been really focused on three distinct solutions. Providing advisory services along the entire life cycle. We provide that to corporations, governments, and a very few select suppliers only in Latin America and Africa right now because we believe it needs development there. We also provide governance and program management solutions. So we provide actually resources to companies to support their governance and program management efforts, and we provide that both on-site and off-site. And as I talked about through the presentation that you saw, we have a global supply risk monitoring offering that companies subscribe to by picking the targets they want to monitor, targets such as countries, cities, and suppliers. You can see on this slide some of our key clients around the world, number of global 2,000 companies from all sectors, financial services, retail, high-tech, and also governments in terms of how to make themselves much more attractive locations. Personally, I've been very fortunate to be in this industry for the last 2 decades, and so I've really seen the growth of this industry and have been delighted to play a role not just in the United States, but also as this industry has grown in Asia Pacific, and significantly recently been spending a lot of time in Latin America and now also looking at Africa. So David, again, thank you very much. Really appreciate the Outsourcing Institute and your time in helping me with this webinar.